You stand at a funeral, dressed carefully, holding flowers you picked out for a reason you could not fully explain, following a set of rituals nobody had to teach you were important. You already knew where to stand, when to be quiet, what your face was supposed to do. Somewhere deep in your species, this response to death is old enough that it may not even be entirely human. For a long time, the assumption in archaeology was simple. Early humans and their close relatives dropped their dead where they fell, or left them behind entirely, the same way most animals do, moving on without looking back. No ceremony. No thought given to a body once the life had left it. That assumption has been falling apart for decades, and the evidence is stranger, older, and considerably more varied than most people expect. In 2013, archaeologist William Rondeau of the French National Center for Scientific Research led a re-excavation of La Chapelle-aux-Saints in France, a site where a nearly complete Neanderthal skeleton had first been discovered back in 1908. The original excavation had been rough by modern standards, and for over a century, researchers debated whether the body had been deliberately buried or simply happened to end up in a natural depression. Rondeau's team went back to the original site with modern techniques, carefully studying the geology of the pit the skeleton had been found in. They concluded the pit did not form naturally. It had been dug, then the body was placed inside and covered relatively quickly afterward, protecting the bones from the kind of weathering and animal scavenging seen elsewhere at the site. A Neanderthal, roughly 50,000 years ago, had been laid to rest on purpose. That alone would be a striking discovery. But the story gets significantly stranger once you look past Neanderthals entirely. In the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa, paleoanthropologist Lee Berger of the University of the Witwatersrand led the discovery of Homo naledi, a small-brained relative in the human family tree with a brain roughly a third the size of yours. Berger's team recovered the remains of over a dozen individuals deep inside a nearly inaccessible chamber of the cave, reachable only through narrow passages that would have required deliberate, repeated effort to enter. Berger has argued this pattern is best explained by intentional body disposal, meaning Homo naledi may have been placing their dead in this hard-to-reach chamber on purpose, despite having a brain far smaller than what many scientists assumed was necessary for that kind of behavior. This claim remains genuinely contested. Many researchers argue the evidence is not yet strong enough to rule out natural explanations, like bodies washing into the chamber through channels that have since closed, or individual naledi becoming lost and dying there without any deliberate placement at all. Critics point out that no stone tools or fire residue have been found deep in the chamber to confirm people were actually working down there rather than the remains arriving some other way. The debate has not been settled, and Berger's team continues gathering evidence to strengthen the case, including controversial claims about deliberately carved marks on the cave walls near the remains. But even as a contested claim, it forces an uncomfortable question. If something with a brain this small might have handled its dead with intention, then whatever produces this behavior may not require the kind of complex thought we usually assume it does. Death was not always handled with what looks like tenderness, either. At Gough's Cave in England, archaeologist Sylvia Bello of the Natural History Museum in London studied human remains dating back roughly 14,700 years and found something unsettling at first glance. Several skulls had been carefully modified into cups, the surrounding bone removed and shaped with precise, controlled cut marks left by stone tools worked slowly across the surface. Bello's analysis found this was not the rough, careless damage typical of survival cannibalism during a famine, where marks tend to be quick, uneven, and focused only on removing meat as fast as possible. The cut marks were deliberate, patient, and consistent, more in line with a ritual practice than a desperate one. The dead at Gough's Cave were not simply discarded or eaten out of necessity. Something was being done to them on purpose, following a process, even if the meaning behind that process is now lost to time. Picture what that range actually looks like laid out together. A Neanderthal lowered gently into a dug pit and covered with care. The dirt packed down close around the body to keep scavengers out. A small-brained relative species possibly carrying its dead deep into darkness through passages barely wide enough for a body, navigating by touch and firelight through a route that offered no practical reward, no food, no shelter, nothing except reaching that specific chamber. A skull deliberately and precisely shaped into something else entirely. The cut marks slow and controlled rather than frantic. These are not three versions of the same behavior. They are three completely different answers to the same question, coming from different branches of the human family tree, separated by tens of thousands of years and enormous gaps in brain size and technology. Here is the twist worth sitting with. None of these behaviors required agriculture, writing, or the kind of complex belief systems people usually associate with the origin of ritual. Even earlier evidence supports this. At Qafzeh Cave in Israel, early Homo sapiens burials dating back roughly 100,000 years included bodies deliberately positioned and covered with red ochre pigment, with deer antlers placed directly against the remains, an arrangement far too specific to be accidental. One individual at the site, a child, was buried with the antlers of a large deer resting across the chest, a placement that required someone to select that specific object, carry it to the grave, and position it with care, rather than simply toss it in alongside the body. Nobody needed permanent villages, stored grain, or written records to do that. They only needed the impulse itself, the willingness to act on it, and someone else nearby who understood, without being told, why it was worth doing at all. The instinct to do something deliberate with a body after death appears to run so deep in the human lineage that it may predate almost every other marker of complex culture we typically look for, showing up before farming, before cities, and quite possibly before full modern human cognition ever existed in the first place. Handling death with intention might not be a byproduct of human intelligence. It might be one of the oldest things intelligence like ours was ever used for. You stand at a funeral, dressed carefully, holding flowers you picked out for a reason you could not fully explain. That instinct did not begin with your grandparents or their grandparents, or even with anyone who could write their reasons down. It runs back through a pit dug by a Neanderthal, through a body carried into a South African cave by hands attached to a brain a third the size of yours, through ochre and antlers laid beside a Homo sapiens burial 100,000 years before anyone thought to ask why it mattered. It mattered before anyone could explain it. Maybe it still does. Think about how many of the small, specific things you do around death you have never once had to think through from scratch. Lowering your voice, bringing something to leave behind, standing a certain way, at a certain distance, in a certain kind of silence. None of it was invented by you, and very little of it was ever fully explained to you in words. It was simply there, waiting, the way it may have been waiting inside a Neanderthal standing over a dug pit, or a small-brained relative carrying someone through the dark toward a chamber they would never leave. If stories like this one make you see your own everyday life differently, hit subscribe. A new story from the deep past goes up every week.